Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully we'll have some more folks trickling in as we get started, but we do want to move ahead in the interest of time. I want to welcome everyone to the research webinar series here hosted by the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, which is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. As I mentioned before, MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, as well as MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started today. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Today, we'll be joined by Dennis Beck from the University of Arkansas Fayetteville, who will be presenting on vulnerable populations in K-12 online learning. Dennis let me know that he would enjoy some audience participation, so if you are equipped with a microphone or headset and you'd like to participate in some conversation via audio, we encourage you to just raise your hand, which you can do by hovering over your name in the participants list on the right-hand side. And once you raise your hand, I or Catherine or any of our other moderators would be happy to grant you microphone rights so you can participate via audio conversation. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Dennis. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that, Justin. And I wanted to kind of start my presentation by telling you a little bit about what this isn't, so that way you can focus a little bit more on what it is. This is not an in-depth presentation of methods and results and implications for one specific study. So that's what it is not. What it is kind of, I guess you could say maybe a 50,000 foot view with a few kind of quick zoom ins at some of the research that I've done with vulnerable populations in K-12 online learning. I'm at the assistant professor level tenure track at the University of Arkansas Fayetteville. And so I'm still very much in the process of developing my research agenda. It is not fully developed yet, but I'm excited about the directions that it's headed. So with that, I'm just going to start out with a few definitions. A lot of people use different definitions. Sometimes they're synonymously said for a cyber school and a virtual school. I've taken Michael Barber's definitions that he has presented in that 2013 book chapter. And that's a cyber school being an accredited institution where students are engaged in full-time online learning, and a virtual school being one where students take online courses as a supplement to face-to-face instruction. And then a charter school, and although this might also somewhat differ from state to state, most of the time charter schools are schools that receive public money but are not subject to some of the rules that apply to public schools, and most of the time they are privately owned as well. So with that, I wanted to start with those definitions because sometimes different people have different views, and I'm not here to argue definitions. I'm here more to just kind of let you know where I'm coming from. A little bit about the background. I say vulnerable populations, and I know that can conjure up all kinds of different ideas from different academic fields. So once again, I wanted to say where I'm coming from is from the National Bioethics Advisory Commission. Their report in 2001 on ethical and policy issues in research involving human participants. It was a report and recommendations of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission. And they look at 5 different types of vulnerability: cognitive or communicative, institutional or deferential, medical, economic, and social. And so looking at these different types of vulnerabilities, I've really focused my research on the institutional, deferential, and social vulnerabilities. And what do I mean by institutional? I mean institutional is Even though the participant has a cognitive capacity to consent as a participant, they they are still subject to formal authority of others who may have independent interests in whether they agree to enroll in a research study or agree to be involved in a charter school or an online charter school. And also deferential vulnerability, the difference between the two, institutional and deferential, is more talking about the authority type. It's more of a informal authority versus a instead of a formal hierarchy. And then a social vulnerability is it's more of people belonging to undervalued social groups, and as a result, it's the function of the social perception of these groups, which can include stereotyping and can lead to discrimination, and that leads to that level of vulnerability. So that's kind of the definitions that I'm going with and have gone with from the literature. And so I'll just move forward to the next slide. The vulnerable populations that I focused on in my research are families, mainly in cyber charter schools, students and parents, and then kind of drilling down into those ethnic minorities as well as special education students and parents. And students in cyber charter schools qualify, and families really do, as vulnerable populations because they are subject to formal authority relationships. So they're more of those institutionally vulnerable populations. And they're subject to those formal and informal authority relationships that may put them at risk for not receiving the same education, thus constituting a potential threat to their future quality of life. And then you could see there's some other socially vulnerable populations there. There are some actually socially vulnerable populations that are involved, and that's more of the ethnic minorities and the special education students. Teachers, by the way, in cyber charter schools also, in my view, qualify as a vulnerable population because they're often unprotected in cyber charters by teacher unions and other structures that help protect teacher rights. Although Arkansas being a right-to-work state, I never said that. We'll move on to the next slide. Research questions. These are some of the research questions I looked at, and you might say immediately, whoa, leadership. You didn't say anything about leadership. Well, I have done some research with leaders, mainly because of the impact that leaders have on these vulnerable populations. So a study I did a few years ago with Jason LaFrance, formerly of Georgia Southern, now of Florida Southern, I believe, University, looked at the state of K-12 leadership preparation for online leadership posts at CAPE accredited certified universities. And also looking at some of the teacher practices and supports for meeting the needs of diverse students in cyber schools. Because once again, the influence the teachers have on the vulnerable students there. So that's some of those research questions. And I'll share about a little bit about the results as I go. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask. For the next slide, I've looked at understanding the reasons why special education students and parents choose a cyber school. And I've compared the satisfaction of special education students and parents with teaching and learning and school culture in their cyber school and comparing that to their previous brick and mortar school. Specifically in those, I was looking at whether they are more likely than their general education peers to cite different factors as reasons for choosing a cyber school. Or do they express greater relative satisfaction with different aspects of teaching and learning and school culture criteria at their current cyber school versus their former prior school? I have to figure out what slide. Yes. In terms of ethnic minorities and students of different genders, I looked at which gender students and parents have higher school satisfaction in cyber schools and which race students and parents have higher school satisfaction. So these are just a few. For example, with these questions, um, hypothesized that girls would have higher school satisfaction than boys. I have hypothesized that African American students would have higher school satisfaction than Caucasian students. Hypothesized that Latino students would have higher school satisfaction than Caucasian students. And general ed students would have higher school satisfaction than special ed students. All those hypotheses were based on literature from the face-to-face classroom. And it came up with some really interesting results in that I'll share a little bit later. Similar, but slightly divergent hypotheses for parents as well. Okay, next one. A little bit about my methods and instruments. I mainly use some mixed methods surveys to do some case studies with a few different schools for the educational leadership study. There was a survey and some interviews with NCATE accredited institutions so that was for that one. For the teacher survey, it was teachers in a couple of different cyber schools in a northeastern state. And so very much, I would say that the largest N of all those surveys was about 300 students and about 500 parents. So that was probably the largest. The teachers, there was about 160 in them. Some qualitative interviews for some of the surveys I've done, and a lot of demographic data collection as well. Definitely what I would call skimming the surface type methods, just to try to get an idea of what's going on and where we're at in the process for these questions, and kind of figure out where to go from here. A few results for the administrators in particular. Very few, only 8.3% of the CAPE and CAPE accredited programs for pre-service administrator preparation offered an online field experience component for these administrators preparing to lead in the online school. And of those 8.3%, only 2 programs actually had a proactive plan to offer such an experience. And what I mean by that in terms of a proactive plan is they were quite frank, the administrators were quite frank in saying, the administrative preparation faculty were quite honest in telling me that students came to them and said, I want to be a leader of an online school. Can I do a field experience in an online school? And so they had to be kind of more reactionary and set something up on the fly, which says a couple things. It says, one, that they're very flexible and they're willing to flex and do that, which is very laudable, but also they didn't have a proactive plan in place to offer such an experience in the first place, which is a little bit troubling. So that's a few results from that, and that is that came out, I want to say 2014 or 13, 14 I believe, in Edmund Quarterly, if you want to look that up. Some results for teachers, and this particular manuscript is actually right now under review, so you can't look that up, but if you want to receive a copy, just shoot me an email. Some of the things that we came up with this is really kind of interesting. We surveyed teachers in 2 separate cyber charters in a northeast state, and looked at in particular what are teachers' differentiation, practices of differentiation, and what type of things what are the resources that they have access to? What do they do to differentiate their instruction? It's something that I've not seen much literature on in online learning, and really have sought that out in this. And one of the first findings that we came up with, we had some qualitative and quantitative here, but from the qualitative data that's already been analyzed, is that online teachers really overwhelmingly feel a need to differentiate for learning styles in their cyber classroom. And what it seemed to be due to was they had a very easy access to multiple modes of instruction online. So they could access any sort of media, any sort of audio, video, animation, and they had access to just a wide variety of things that they could use to differentiate for the learning styles of the student. Um, it's somewhat interesting because it's very much in contrast to the face-to-face classroom where teachers often cite the ability of the student as the reason why that they differentiate rather than the learning styles. So online teachers saying they differentiate because of learning styles, and whereas the face-to-face classroom teachers differentiate because of the ability of the student. And specifically about above grade level or below grade level. So less of an emphasis on grade level, more of an emphasis on learning styles. It's a little concerning because of neuroscientific research that's discovered very limited evidence to support the idea that individuals learn in different ways through different learning styles. So it's really an area for further study. We're planning on some follow-up interviews in the spring with these teachers to find out a little bit more of what they meant. And then, yes, so that was the first finding here, that where it says online teachers see learning styles as key to differentiate. The second one is that online teachers report that they need to differentiate content. They need to differentiate content, product, and process. And that was somewhat kind of interesting here, is that that is very much a confirmation of the face-to-face classroom literature as a very integral for a differentiated classroom. So teachers seem to be following best practices for differentiation, but they're doing it for different reasons. Then the last major finding was that there was little mention of using assessment to inform differentiation. And I have to emphasize here, these were two cyber charters that were kind of homegrown charters that were not connected to a specific larger content provider or curriculum provider, and they created all of their stuff from scratch. So this may be a context-specific result as a result. But the fact that there was little mention of using assessment to inform differentiation is a surprise because of the current effort to use data to assess teachers in online learning. By utilizing data and feedback from staff, cyber school leaders are able to provide timely, personalized, ongoing professional development that to the leaders appeared to be of higher quality and quantity than that provided in a face-to-face school. And it seems like that practice of assessing teachers by administrators hasn't quite, at least for these two schools, gotten to where teachers using data for assessment, which is a real concern because that's where differentiation should occur in online learning, where teachers are using data on students, where they are in relation to their learning goals to inform daily decision making about what's next for them. In particular, using formative assessment. And that's something that has really gained prominence in the face-to-face classroom in the last several years. And the absence in these schools is somewhat troubling. So that's some of the teacher-related research I've done. And I'm going to move on now to the next slide. Here's some on the student satisfaction research here. So a little bit about student satisfaction. Girls rate cyber school as more satisfying than boys, which confirms the literature from research done in the face-to-face classrooms, for face-to-face classrooms. So it seems to be just following larger national trends in the United States. Latinos expressed higher school satisfaction than Caucasians. And that also confirmed literature that Latinos are generally more satisfied as a group of students. And by the way, these are just for students here. We'll talk about parents in a minute. It also confirms what we seem to know about race and satisfaction, but while applying it to a cyber school setting. African American school satisfaction, interestingly enough, even though in the literature it said differently, there was no significant difference than that for Caucasians or Latinos. And I think that may reflect a little bit more the uniform nature of the schools, while the different research confirms, the face-to-face literature research looked at students across several schools of various characteristics. And then lastly, there are the special education students. They were significantly more satisfied with SunTech than general ed students. And interestingly enough, that was completely against what literature from the face-to-face classroom said, um, and is also an aspect that we are kind of pursuing and trying to figure out through some further follow-up interviews and things to figure out why, some of the reasons why. No significant results for parents. I think it's probably a result of the fact that these schools were 7th through 12th grade, and the students were mostly actually in 9th through 12th. And so as a result, I think at that age, parents are taking a little bit more of a step back in controlling or being kind of in the driver's seat of their kids' education, and kids are taking a step forward. And so the results are definitely for parents who are weaker. Next slide. Some of the reasons they chose cyber, in particular here. There were teaching and learning related reasons, and in particular, things that they could choose among teaching and learning related issues were the teachers, the curriculum, the online format suiting my learning style, my special needs not being served at my previous school, and a broader range of classes than my previous school. Bullying related issues were things like I was experiencing behavioral problems at the previous school, which bullying is often categorized in the literature as a behavioral problem. And then secondly, I was being bullied at a previous school, and actually one like that. Interestingly enough, of the results here, special ed students expressed greater relative satisfaction on 5 of the 7 related criteria, very interestingly here. And then on respect between teachers and students as well, respect between students, there was also significant differences. And once again, for this one, results from parent surveys were, although there were a few consistent significant things, they were less significant. Okay, so I kind of zoomed through that in order to take a pause here a little bit. And before I get to the next slide, let me go back to the other one, is just to stop and ask for a few questions on what I've presented so far. And then, because the next few slides is more going to be about what's next, what I have planned next in the presentation. You can use the chat. Feel free to use the mic. Kevin?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Dennis, I just, we were kind of talking about this yesterday, and I'm really interested in this, and I was really happy early on in the presentation you defined vulnerable populations, because I think that's going to be something that's going to be continually question, like how are you defining vulnerable? And also, that's such a broad category that it'd probably difficult to look at the totality. But one of the things that I'm interested in, it's almost counterintuitive, and maybe if you could explain a little bit, is kind of the reaction of the perceptions of bullying and your special education students in terms of kind of how that played out as a rationale for choosing cyber schools, because again, from a legal perspective, you have some pretty compelling evidence that your special education population are disproportionately bullied in traditional school settings. And there's at least some anecdotal evidence, not empirical, that at least some of the reasons some special ed students choose virtual schools, cyber schools, charter schools and the like, is to kind of avoid the incessant bullying, particularly online, the cyberbullying that people express. So maybe if you can kind of explain kind of how that played itself out in your research. I'll stop now.
No, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that question. One of the interesting things from this research that came out was that special ed students seem to choose bullying social reasons significantly as a reason that they chose cyber school, chose their cyber school in both of these schools that we studied. And once again, I want to hesitate. I'm not trying to generalize this in any way to the larger population of cyber school students. And I think that's one of the next steps is to find a way to generalize it. But I've had several conversations with the directors of retention and recruitment at both of these schools. And they seem to, anecdotally at least, not empirically, but anecdotally say that the students, that special ed students do, and that confirmed my empirical research, do choose for bullying and social reasons, but also for some teaching and learning reasons. In particular, students on the autism spectrum choosing online learning option or a cyber school, so that way they have more of an ability to focus in a quiet environment rather than a lot of things going on around them in a face-to-face classroom. That's one small example. So anecdotally, that's the picture they painted, but anecdotally, they also painted a picture of having a lot of trouble retaining students from special ed who are special education students. And they'd be in for a few months to a year, and then they're out, and that most of the time, if they stayed in, it was because they came there because of teaching and learning focused reasons. And if they came there for bullying or social reasons, they left quickly. So I'm not sure of the reasons. And once again, I hesitate to mention it because it is anecdotal, kind of in a conversation with both of these directors of retention. But I think it says a lot for some future research directions. I would definitely like to do something that's a little bit more longitudinal and follow students from the point of they're in there and find their first year and find out why they came and track them, and then when they leave, find out why they left, which of course will be the hard part because directors of retention, they just kind of smiled at me when I said I wanted to do that. They're like, you'll never get a hold of them after they leave, which is probably true, but doesn't damp my enthusiasm for trying. So that's a little bit about that research. Kevin, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's where I was kind of. It's a really complex interaction. The idea of kind of being influenced to initially attend a cyber charter school due to bullying, but then also how that rationale is justified by the teaching and learning reasons. And obviously, I know this is not a large-scale study, but it'd be really interesting to see in future research to kind of look at a more representative sample and see how this plays itself out. And of course, even within the special ed population, you have these variations of mild, moderate, and severe disabilities. So, for example, is that child with Asperger's syndrome, much more likely to kind of choose the cyber charter school based on the teaching and learning reasons, bullying, and again, I think that's really good. I think David just brought up something in the chat box too, which is in many instances, do these vulnerable populations actually choose their learning environments, or as legal minors, are they chosen for them? Which I think is an important consideration. Who's driving the attendance? Is it the parents, or, for the older kids, is it their actual reason? Because at least some of the cases that I've analyzed in cyber charter schools environments, particularly for special ed, in the higher education level, it's been the student themselves that's kind of justified their reason to leave a traditional public school setting to a cyber charter school. So anyway, I think a lot of research is there. Thank you for addressing it. It's an interesting finding.
Sure, and to address David's position, and Daleen, I apologize, I am going to get to yours as well. But to address David's about that, one of the questions or one of the options on our survey that when we looked at different students, when we asked the students and the parents their reasons that they chose, was one of the said, the last one was, like for the parents, was it was the student's choice. And the last one for the parents was it was my parents' choice. So we gave them that out in a way to choose and to say it's all on the parent, it's all on the student. And that in itself, I think, helps to qualify. We only looked at, when we looked at the student data, we only looked at students who did not choose that option of it was my parents' decision. So these are students who made the decision for themselves, and this was the reasons they chose, if that kind of makes sense. And then I almost lost the mic there for a minute. I clicked a different tab on my internet browser. That's what happens when you're nervous a little. But you said you meant they can't choose because of funds, location, access to technology. That's true as well. I think that's true, but with more and more things, like for example, our district is currently choosing applying for the district where our university is located is applying for a conversion charter in order to open up a kindergarten through 12th grade virtual school to provide supplement as well as for those who want to be full-time. And they have kind of stated their target as formerly homeschooled or private schooled students who do not want to integrate into the full-time, which still does not address your particular question, but you're correct. There are certain groups. I wouldn't paint it with such a broad swath, though. I mean, I think that when you talk about ethnic minorities, you would have to then say, well, I would say low SES ethnic minorities probably lack the opportunity to choose their learning environments more so. I would also say you could, but if you look at special ed students, I think it's much less so in that case, because I think a lot of special ed students have enough support from their school system and from the community to be able to choose their learning environment. So and then back up here a little bit to Dayleen's question. Do you have any data regarding vulnerable populations in blended learning environments? Not yet. Not yet. However, that is something that I have thought about as well. I have just more focused my research on fully online cyber schools because that's kind of where my research agenda is going. Any other questions, follow-up questions on what I've shared so far before I move on to where I'm going? All right then. Well, with that, I'm going to share a little bit about what's next. Oops, did someone else trying to talk? Okay. So what's next is, I think it's important to point out a few things where this kind of research narrative is taking us. From some of these results, vulnerable student populations appear to be seeking out online schools, in particular cyber schools, for one reason or another. The reasons that we have, that I've explored so far, are very contextual in these schools, and I hesitate to apply them out widespread and generalize them. But they seem to be seeking out online schools for one reason or another. However, administrators and teachers seem unprepared to integrate vulnerable populations into their schools. And what do I mean by that? Well, from the research I did with administrators, they're not being trained as pre-service administrators to lead online schools. Oh, thank you, Tracy. I just saw that you're leaving, or you already left. I apologize. And so for administrators who are unprepared, they're not going to be prepared to know how to integrate these vulnerable populations in their schools. And then for teachers, differentiated instruction is one of the key hallmarks for integrating vulnerable populations in their classroom. And they apparently are, at least in these two schools, very much struggling with this aspect of teaching. And so that brings us to a few questions. And that's the first is, what needs to be done? What needs to be done to better prepare administrators and teachers? And then what are the other vulnerable populations that might be involved? And how do these things going on in cyber schools affect them? So I've been kind of open on my methods and in my research, and I'm in the process of trying to get a website, a separate server up where I can post my data and make it open. I think my university is a little bit nervous about me doing that. They seem to be keep referring me to legal when I do that. I'm not sure why, but universities, you know. But that's my goal, is to kind of post everything, have it freely available for other people to do research on as well. But I think my methods, the survey data is good. And it's important to gather survey and some basic interview data in order to get a handle on the scope of the situation, and to gain a better understanding of what is possibly going on in this vulnerable populations in K-12 online learning. I think the next steps in the progression would be to expand the surveys to a larger audience of students, parents, and teachers. In particular, one idea I have is I'm in negotiation right now with one of the larger curriculum providers, and who partner and kind of create nonprofit schools in different states, and kind of having the same surveys but having them out to the entire the United States, so kind of gaining a more generalizable results as a result. And then also look more longitudinally at issues of retention and achievement and see if there are correlations there, and to go kind of deeper qualitatively into what are those reasons that they're coming in, how does it affect whether they're staying or not, and their achievement, those sorts of things. Another approach that I've been somewhat interested in is taking a more, and I know Catherine's ears might perk up here with this, is take a more phenomenological approach to examining how a cyber charter school functions, just simply by doing interviews with people in every department and observing, a lot of observation, and just to try to see how the whole puzzle works together, interviewing a whole lot of different teachers in every department, interviewing people in retention and recruitment, interviewing people in marketing, interviewing leadership, all the way down to interviewing students and parents, etc. And I think it could yield important insights into how cyber charters work and influence vulnerable populations. And then I think eventually, after doing some of that larger scale research, kind of go to more of a design-based research approach, which, if you're not familiar with it, blends empirical educational research with the theory-driven design of learning environments. And really, I think that's an important methodology for understanding how, when, and why educational innovations work in practice, and for both teachers and students, and their parents, I think could be beneficial. So that's a little bit about my about kind of my future, and I'd like to hear from you all, kind of your thoughts on my future. And by the way, Catherine, that I see your comment there. Yay for phenomenology. I've actually already done 30 hours of interviews, and I just got 2 undergraduate interns assigned to me who are doing transcription right now of those. So the dream may be occurring. It may be happening. It's just I have a lot more interviews to do actually. So.
Yeah, that's great news to hear, and it's good that you have some support there because, man, does it take a long time to do it yourself. I can attest to that. One of the questions or more comments that I had, and I'm sorry I had to step away for a little bit to take a urgent phone call, but I did hear you talking about parental involvement, especially in cyber charters. And one of the things that came to mind is Heidi Curtis and Lori Worth out of Northwest Nazarene University just published an article in the Journal of Online Learning Research on fostering student success and engagement in K-12 online schools. And they did a lot of interviews with parents, and I think that might be helpful in informing some of your work moving forward. So I just wanted to let you know that. So it's in issue 2 on the Journal of Online Learning Research, and I'll post the link in there. But yeah, I think you're doing great work, and I think your future work is really exciting, and I'm happy to hear about it.
So thank you, Catherine, for that comment. Yeah, I mean, in terms of methods, I know that there are some researchers who tend to kind of settle on one. They're phenomenological researchers, or they're case study researchers all their lives. But I kind of have a more of a perspective of finding the right research, or finding the research agenda first, and then kind of using the methods that fit my questions. And so that's kind of why it may seem like I've somewhat bounced around a little bit, but there is a method to my madness.
I think a mixture is good.
So thank you, David. I'm glad you liked it. What I'm putting here is people ask me a lot about the Barber book chapter, where I get the definitions from of cyber and virtual schools, and I put that reference there, and then the reference to the National Bioethics Advisory Commission report, and it took me a while to find that report, so there's an actual link there to the page. And then the different peer-reviewed articles, I did not include the one that is under review right now for teachers differentiation, but the other ones are all there on this page, just for your perusal and viewing. Any other questions? And David, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see your note here. It says most of the vulnerable populations we work with don't have engaged parents actively seeking cyber education. You know, this is an interesting comment, David, because that's true. However, I'd put a big however in there. Most cyber schools require either a parent or a guardian who will act as a learning coach for that student. And I've seen it work in a lot of different ways. So it's different for every family, and often different from cyber school to cyber school. Sarah, kind of your traditional parents, mother, father, both still in the house, and one of them is the learning coach. There are parents who are single parents who still sign up as the learning coach. And yes, the learning coach is required in that case, required for enrollment. And I'll follow up your question here. Yes, that does become somewhat of an invisible barrier sometimes to vulnerable populations for getting in to the cyber school. However, I think some cyber schools have really come up with some unique ways of getting around it. And one of the ways is one of the schools in the Northeast state that I did this research in has, I forget what they call them, but essentially, they call them centers. And they're mostly in inner city areas where for single parents to drop their kids off in the morning. And it's basically a bank of computers, and there is a facilitator there who is not an accredited teacher. I'm just telling you how it's done. I'm not saying I agree with it or not. And that facilitator is not their teacher of the subjects. They still interact with all their teachers online, but that facilitator is their learning coach. And that person is the one who acts in that role to make sure that they do their homework, to make sure that they are keeping up with logging on and all those sorts of things. So almost as an academic advisor in one way, but a lot more hands-on of one that would do that sort of a thing at the secondary level rather than at college. Yeah, it's interesting. In this particular state, what they do is the school provides the bank of computers, all the computers free, and the location, it's usually a nonprofit center or a church or a synagogue, a mosque, whatever, and I don't know about libraries. I've not seen any libraries do it at this point, but they provide the computers, and then in exchange, they kind of have free rent. And the students are still, when they enroll, it's still a certain amount per student per year, kind of a deal, where the students are from the state. I don't know if you heard me say that. I just moved back to my research agenda here. Did you hear me say that part? Because I just noticed my mic was muted. Justin, Catherine, anybody? Okay, you did hear that. Great. So if you do have any specific feedback, you can email me. You can let me know what you might, if you have ideas on where I can pursue the different ideas, large data sets that might be available, small data sets, schools that might be open to doing surveys, all those sorts of things. Recording, just so people can see it. There's my contact information, debeck@uark.edu. You can email me that stuff as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dennis. We really appreciate you sharing the research. This is definitely valuable research, and it sounds like from what your colleagues and our other participants were sharing with us, some very applicable stuff that we can use moving forward. So thank you for sharing.
My pleasure.
Before we end, I just wanted to make mention of a couple other opportunities and initiatives of ours here at the Virtual Learning Research Institute. We'd encourage everyone to check out our podcast series, which is called Virtual Viewpoints. The link is posted there in the slide deck. We actually just had a chance to sit down with the Director of Curriculum at the New Tech Network to talk a little bit about their focus on project-based learning and a little bit of blended learning. We also have our guest blogger program. So if you're interested in writing for us, we do offer a stipend for certain writings. We do have some guidelines on that program that you can read about by clicking the link there. All of these initiatives are listed under our main website, which is MVLRI.org. We are also hosting the pre-conference workshop, which is the research community meeting for the INACOL Symposium, November 8th, 2015, from 1 to 4. And I was going to let Catherine just talk a little bit about what folks can expect from that research community meeting.
Thanks, Justin. So yeah, we're going to be hosting the research community meeting at the INACOL Symposium on November 8th from 1 to 4. And we have Kathy Kavanaugh from Microsoft, who is going to be kicking off the event. with a nice keynote, and then we'll have some grant offering institutes such as IES and NSF and possibly some foundations, including Gates, who will be talking more about funding opportunities for K-12 online and blended learning research. And then we'll also have some time for everyone to do some meet and greet and networking and try to find out where paths are crossing and topics are aligning in terms of people's research agendas. So we hope that you will have time to join us for that.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Again, I echo what Catherine said. We hope to see everyone there to engage in some great conversation. In the meantime, you can feel free to reach out to us, send us some feedback on our webinar series or any of our other initiatives via email at mvlri@mivu.org. You can also sign up for our mailing list where you'll hear about some of our other initiatives, including our podcast series, our webinars, just about anything and everything that we put out. And we also use that mailing list to bring your attention to the work of others as well. So feel free to sign up for that mailing list by clicking the link there on the slide. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handles are listed there, as well as our LinkedIn page and our YouTube channel where we host the recordings of all of our webinars. You can expect the recording of this webinar to be posted pretty shortly, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. You can also see all of our upcoming scheduled webinars on our website, mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. Again, we want to thank everyone for coming out, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Take care.